I went to dinner with my in-laws at a restaurant and saw my wife and a strange man at the next table, and in that moment, my world, which until then had seemed stable and predictable, simply collapsed into silence. I stood up, my heart weighing a ton, walked over to their table, and, with eyes filled with pain, said only what my soul could bear, "I brought your parents to dinner here with me, and they saw you with this man. I'm ashamed and sad. I hope you know what you're doing." And then, without waiting for an answer, I walked away, my breath ragged, feeling that, by walking through that glass door, I was leaving behind not only the restaurant, but the woman I loved. It's funny how the sound of dishes, the clinking of cutlery, and the murmur of the room became distant, as if everything had been covered by thick glass, as if the whole world had gone silent to hear my heart breaking. In the car, the pain didn't come all at once. It came in waves. One memory at a time. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, the first time she called me love on a Sunday morning. Every moment now tasted bitter, distorted by the betrayal in her eyes as she smiled at another man, as she touched his arm the way she used to touch mine. Her in-laws, silent, looked at her as if they saw something they wished they hadn't. And in that moment, I realized the weight of the betrayal wasn't mine alone. She had betrayed her parents' respect, her children's innocence, the entire family's trust. I arrived home as if carrying the dead body of my own hope. I locked myself in my room and, for the first time in years, cried like a child, sobs tearing from my throat. Not from anger, but from loss. Because there, it wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of the certainty that I was loved, that everything I had built was solid. And the next day, it wasn't her silence that destroyed me. It was the shame in the eyes of our children, who couldn't understand how anyone could hurt someone who loved them so much. She tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't serious, that it was a moment of weakness, that she still loved me. But when her own parents said, "We never thought you were capable of this," she understood she'd crossed a line from which she couldn't return. The shame didn't come just from me. It came from everyone around her. From her parents, her children, close friends, neighbors who whispered. Even the dog's silence seemed to judge her. And yet, she persisted. She called, wrote letters, showed up at the door crying, kneeling, saying she regretted it, that she wanted to start over. She said that dinner meant nothing, that it was just a thoughtless mistake. But thoughtless mistakes leave deep scars. And every time she said, "I'm sorry," all I could think was, why did you make a fool of me in front of the people who matter most? There was no hatred in me. Only a deep pain, which made me wake up in the middle of the night sweating, reliving the betrayal like a nightmare on loop. I tried to understand where I went wrong, what I failed to give, what she was looking for in another man. And the answer was always the same: I didn't deserve that. The children, small mirrors of what we once were, tried to understand. They didn't hate her, but they distanced themselves. They began to ask uncomfortable questions, seeking in me the strength they once saw in her. She tried to get closer, but each gesture was met with an awkward silence, with eyes that asked, why? And when she saw that it wasn't just my love she'd lost, but also the trust of her children and the respect of her own parents, something inside her broke. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. But it was too late. Because amidst the chaos, the mourning of a history that was dissolving, someone emerged. A different woman, discreet, sensitive. She didn't come to take up anyone's space, she simply held my hand at the right moment. She was kind to my children, she listened to me in the early hours of the morning when I still cried over my ex, and she never tried to erase the past, she simply built something new with me. And when I least expected it, I found myself smiling again, without guilt, without fear. I found myself loved without having to beg for it. My ex-wife, now alone, watched everything from afar. She saw her children grow closer to their new partner, saw the smiles return, saw that life went on, just without her. And the most painful thing for her wasn't losing me. It was realizing that she was still loved, but unwanted. She was still remembered, but no longer needed. That forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. She wasn't banished, but she was no longer at the center of our lives either. She was like a piece that no longer fits in the puzzle, even though she still exists. Today, when she visits her children, the mood is still light, but there's something that never fully returns. An invisible crack. They forgave her, I forgave her, but she knows, and will know every day, that she destroyed something she can never rebuild in the same way. And perhaps the cruelest of punishments is precisely this: to be forgiven, but not forgotten. To be accepted, but not loved in the same way. To see the love she lost blossom in the hands of another, while she lives with the remnants of what could have been. And the man she cheated on me with? He disappeared. He vanished after breaking up with her. She said she didn't want trouble, she didn't want responsibility, she never intended to stay with her. She thought she was trading a stable life for an overwhelming passion, but she ended up with emptiness. A nothingness disguised as adventure. And that's when she understood, in the cruelest of silences, that she hadn't just lost her husband, she'd lost her ground. Her name. Her family. Her respect. She traded everything for a moment of illusion. And now she lives with the lucidity of someone who looks back and realizes she destroyed the only place where she was truly loved. But the story doesn't end there. Because on a typical weekend, when the kids were with me and my new partner was making breakfast, someone knocked on the door. It was her. With red eyes and trembling hands. She asked to come in. Not to get back together. But to say something. Something that, to this day, I don't know if I was ready to hear, or endure. And what she said to me that morning, forever changed the way I saw everything I had experienced. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, our fictional stories vividly show how infidelity can destroy lives, homes and hearts. Each narrative is a warning, a lesson, a mirror of what should never be done to those who truly love us. Get ready now to hear a story strong, realistic and deeply shocking. Take a deep breath, the truth behind the betrayal is about to be revealed. His name was Daniel. 42 years old, father of two, and married for over a decade to the woman he met at 26, on a gray Sunday that, ironically, would become the most colorful of his life. Helena, 24 at the time, with a shy laugh, a deep gaze, passionate about literature and the way he served coffee, that was all Daniel needed to know. Destiny was there, sitting 2 tables away, reading Clarice Lispector while biting the tip of a blue pen. What began as an unpretentious encounter between strangers with similar tastes grew quickly, deeply, like roots that don't ask permission from the soil. They became life partners, accomplices in the chaos and small victories of everyday life. Helena was calm, analytical, sensitive, yet firm. Daniel was protective, methodical, and loyal. She liked French music and chamomile tea. He preferred classic rock and strong coffee. And yet, they fit together. They built a love story made of gestures, not empty promises. Daniel was always a man who demonstrated his love through actions. He picked up the children from school, even after a stressful workday, bought Helena flowers for no reason at all, and wrote down important dates in an old notebook she said was outdated but kept with care. Helena, in turn, filled the house with poetry and care. The way she organized the books on the shelf, the way she folded his clothes with almost ceremonial care, or the way she always made a point of leaving a message in his lunchbox, even after so many years, showed that she, too, loved him intensely, even if, sometimes, without saying it. Their home was modest but lively. The children's laughter filled the rooms in the morning, and the smells from Helena's kitchen seemed to embrace anyone who walked through the door. Their 2 children, Lucas and Clara, inherited their mother's sensitivity and their father's empathy. They were polite, curious, full of difficult questions and an almost cruel ability to perceive what adults were not saying. Daniel and Helena had a firm routine, shaped by waking up early, dividing tasks, taking the children to activities, working, and, in the evenings, trying to find time for themselves between responsibilities. Theirs wasn't a perfect life. But no one saw them as a fragile couple. They were, in everyone's eyes, a solid, respectable, and admired family. Daniel worked as a logistics manager for a mid-sized shipping company, and even though he didn't love his job, he never allowed himself to slack off on the commitments that supported his family. Helena was a history teacher at a private school. She had an almost sacred passion for what she did, and her students adored her. She was the kind of woman who would rather receive a rare book than a jewel, who was moved by documentaries and who wept secretly when grading essays that spoke of loss. At home, she was a doting mother, a devoted wife, a centered woman. But there had been a quiet restlessness in her eyes these past few months. Nothing blatant. Nothing Daniel could point to and say, "It started here." It was like a nearly invisible crack in the glass, subtle, yet progressive. The marriage remained what most would call stable. The children were doing well in school, the bills were under control, Sunday dinners with the in-laws continued, and birthdays were celebrated with cake, balloons, and music. But there was a silent absence in the small details. Kisses became quicker, hugs less lingering. Conversations became more about obligations than feelings. The bed, once a refuge, was now shared out of exhaustion, not desire. And yet, Daniel didn't feel unhappy. Just, worn out. But he saw this as a natural part of life as a couple. After all, who, after so many years, can maintain the same fire? It wasn't a lack of love. It was routine. It was real life. And he believed it with all his might. Their social circle was also predictable. Old friends, couples who had known them for years, co-workers. The children's school was also a constant meeting point with other families. There were group lunches, children's parties, school meetings. Daniel's life was simple. Linear. And that was exactly what he found beautiful. Predictability gave him security. He was never a man for adventures, impulses, or rash decisions. He was one of those who preferred to know where he stood. And because he trusted the woman by his side so much, he never imagined he would have to suspect anything. Helena, on the other hand, had been going through a silent process of internal reflection. It was as if she were being pulled from within, by feelings and thoughts she couldn't organize. The classes were demanding a lot of her, the students were more distracted, the administration demanded results, and at home, as much as she loved her children deeply, she felt like she was always on autopilot. She tried not to show it. She tried to be the strong, present wife. But her soul was tired. And, at the same time, restless. Something in her begged for change. A new breath. Something new to awaken her. Not that she didn't love Daniel, she deeply respected him. But the absence of something she couldn't name grew within her, like a plant searching for light. She skillfully hid this feeling. After all, she was an admired woman. Friends praised her, her in-laws treated her like a daughter, her parents were proud of her. She was intelligent, cultured, thoughtful. She knew how to smile in family photos, she knew how to disguise a distant look with affection on her children's faces. She knew how to cook with love even when her heart was silent. But deep down, she knew something was slowly breaking. Daniel, though perceptive with his children, wasn't as sensitive to his wife's silences. For him, the absence of arguments meant peace. The lack of conflict was proof that everything was fine. He didn't see the nights she took a long time to fall asleep, the days she avoided prolonged eye contact, or the way she stood in front of the mirror without really looking at herself. Helena, for her part, also didn't know how to ask for help without seeming ungrateful. Because that was exactly what she felt, guilt for not being fulfilled, even with a loving family. The couple's routine continued as usual. Sundays were reserved for Helena's parents. Long lunches, homemade desserts, and conversations about politics, children, and aging. Daniel was always very close to his in-laws. He had a genuine affection for them, as if they were his own. And this was also part of what sustained that structure, mutual respect between the families. His father-in-law treated him like a son, his mother-in-law made sure he felt an integral part of it all. One Sunday, while the children were playing in the yard and coffee was being served, Helena received a message on her cell phone. She read it, responded quickly, and tried to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. Daniel didn't notice. He was engrossed in a conversation about renovations at his children's school. The moment passed, as so many others did, unnoticed. It was just another detail. Just another stroke in the grand scheme that, from a distance, still seemed firm and complete. The days that followed were ordinary. Helena taught, Daniel worked, the children came and went with their backpacks and school stories. But in Helena's heart, something was taking shape. And in Daniel's heart, nothing had changed, yet. And it was in this context, in a seemingly normal setting, that the story took shape. A planned dinner, a spontaneous decision, and a night that should have been just another quiet chapter in the life of a family like any other, ended up becoming the turning point between before and after. And what happened that night was just the beginning of a chain of events that would change the fate of all of them forever. That Monday, Daniel left for work earlier than usual. It was the beginning of the month, and the shipping company required him to pay more attention to incoming and outgoing reports, deadlines, and load adjustments. Traffic was light, the sky was slightly overcast, and the radio played an old song that, for a moment, made him smile as he remembered Helena humming the same tune one day, her hair still wet from her shower and a cup of tea in her hands. He didn't know it, but that would be one of the last days he remembered her fondly. That morning, he felt at peace. She threw herself into her work as always, reviewing spreadsheets, sorting out pending issues, and exchanging messages with colleagues. Around 10 o'clock, she texted Helena saying she would stop by Clara's school that evening to pick up the science fair photos. She took longer than usual to respond, and when she did, her voice sounded slightly tired, distracted, but still sweet. She said she had completely forgotten about the fair, apologized, and thanked him for remembering. Later, he would delete that audio like someone burning a love letter. The following days continued seemingly normally. But some small changes began to emerge. Helena started sleeping later, saying she was grading tests, preparing extra materials, or exchanging messages with schoolmates about educational events. Daniel didn't question her. He respected her space and trusted her word. In recent weeks, she had started wearing a new perfume, sweeter than the ones before. She also started putting on makeup more often, even on days when she said she didn't have school meetings. All of this subtly drew attention, but didn't arouse immediate suspicion. After all, changes happen. And he always believed that love was, above all, trust. At the end of that week, a muggy Friday, Helena came home saying she would have a pedagogical meeting with some schoolmates the following week, that evening, at a restaurant they liked. She mentioned it in passing, as if mentioning something irrelevant. Daniel nodded, said he would stay with the children, and asked if she needed a ride. She said no, that she would take a taxi and be back early. He smiled. So far, everything seemed normal. And even though something small inside him was beginning to bother him with the frequency of their appointments and the increasingly silent absence of his wife by his side, he forced himself not to think anything of it. In truth, he was proud to have an active, dear wife, respected by her colleagues. He never imagined her capable of breaking with what they had built. On Sunday afternoon, he suggested dinner with his in-laws at a restaurant they'd frequented for years. He said he wanted a change of pace, to get her parents out of the house, to do something different. Helena hesitated for a second, then smiled tightly and agreed. But she asked to go straight to the work restaurant, claiming she was going to school first to settle some matters with a colleague. Daniel found her dry tone odd but didn't comment. At 7:15 p.m., he left with his in-laws and children, all in high spirits, for dinner. On the way, he bought flowers for his mother-in-law and a rose for Helena, something he did occasionally as a spontaneous gesture of affection. He was feeling light-hearted, though his wife's absence on the bus had left a small shadow over his thoughts. Upon arriving at the restaurant, they greeted the maitre d', sat at one of the central tables, and ordered. The atmosphere was pleasant, his in-laws were laughing with their grandchildren, and Daniel, for a moment, let himself relax. He drank a glass of wine, joked with Clara about dessert, and looked around absently. It was at that moment, when he turned his face slightly toward the next room, that time seemed to stand still. At the next table, 3 steps away, Helena was smiling. But it wasn't at him. She was sitting with another man. A stranger. And she was smiling in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. A light, intimate smile, a smile he knew well. Her hand rested on the table, and the man touched her fingers as if the world around them had disappeared. They were so absorbed that they didn't notice his immediate presence. The impact was like an invisible punch. Daniel took precious seconds to process what he was seeing. The fork slipped from his hand and hit the plate with a metallic sound that made his mother-in-law look at him. His father-in-law, alert, turned around too, and within seconds, they both saw the same scene. Silence was instantaneous. Daniel stood up slowly, as if the ground were unstable. His children watched him in confusion. He walked to the table where his wife was sitting and stopped in front of her. Helena saw him. She went pale. Her lips parted as if trying to find words, but no air came. The man beside her widened his eyes, surprised, uncomprehending. Daniel, his voice choked but firm, said what he needed to say. He didn't shout, he didn't make a scene. He simply looked into the eyes of the woman who once promised to love him until the end and said he had brought her parents to dinner there, that everyone was watching, and that he was sad. Ashamed. He hoped she knew what she was doing. And then he turned, walked back to the table as if his legs weighed tons, apologized to his in-laws, looked at his children, and told them they were leaving. His mother-in-law was in shock, his father-in-law was holding his breath, and the children, not quite understanding, followed their father in silence. As they left, Daniel didn't look back. At home, the silence became a prison. Helena didn't show up that night. She didn't text. She didn't call. Daniel stayed in his room with the children. He said his mother was working on a problem. Clara cried before going to sleep. Lucas remained silent. His father-in-law called in the middle of the night, asking if they were okay. His mother-in-law, he said, had been feeling ill. The scandal at the restaurant wasn't huge, but it was enough to expose the shame. And even if no one had made a fuss, what was said there, and what was seen, was impossible to erase. The next day, Helena showed up at home in the morning. She entered silently, dejected. Her eyes were red, her skin pale. Daniel looked at her but said nothing. She tried to speak. She said it wasn't what it seemed. That she was confused. That she needed to explain. He didn't respond. He simply asked her to give him space. Her children hugged her hesitantly, as if unsure how to approach her. The atmosphere was dense, charged. Her father-in-law sent a short message, "We are deeply disappointed." Throughout the week, Helena tried to contact him. She wrote letters. She left messages. She sent audio messages that Daniel didn't hear. She said she wanted to talk. That she'd made a mistake. That the man wasn't important. That she was confused. That it was a phase. But there was no room for more words at that moment. Daniel's silence was his only defense. Trust had been broken. And more than that, he felt that respect, the bare minimum necessary for any relationship to survive, had been undone in front of everyone who mattered. Still, something inside him urged him to understand. To listen. To seek answers. Not to excuse. But to understand. Because the weight of betrayal wasn't just anger. It was pain. It was disbelief. It was mourning. And the more days passed, the more he sensed there was something in that story that hadn't yet surfaced. Something Helena hadn't told him. Something that, somehow, changed everything. She didn't deny the betrayal. But she also didn't say everything. And this gap, this void between the facts and the complete truth, began to consume Daniel like a silent fire. And it was precisely this lack of explanation, this unfilled silence, that led him to accept the meeting Helena requested days later. She said she needed to tell him everything. That there was more. That maybe he'd hate her even more afterward, or maybe he'd understand, but that he deserved to know. What she revealed in that meeting wasn't just an explanation, it was the secret that would change the course of everything. The meeting was scheduled for a cloudy afternoon, at a discreet cafe where no one knew them. Daniel arrived first, as usual, and sat at a table in the far corner, facing the door. He watched people come and go with a mixture of anxiety and detachment, as if his body were there, but his mind still heavy with recent pain. When Helena entered, he almost didn't recognize her immediately. Her hair was loose, a little messy, her eyes sunken and red, her face pale. She carried something in her expression he hadn't seen before, shame. She sat down slowly, staring at him for long seconds without saying anything. He didn't say anything either. He just waited. Until she began to speak, her voice low, hoarse, as if each word were being forced from the back of her throat. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, that she knew what she had done had destroyed him inside, and that she herself now carried a weight that not even the deepest silence could alleviate. He confessed that the man in the restaurant wasn't new in her life. That she hadn't met him by coincidence, nor by chance. That he had long ago been just a name among several college friends, and that he had resurfaced months earlier on social media, with light, relaxed, nostalgic messages. At first, she said she didn't respond with interest. But gradually, faced with the demands of routine, the empty nights, the moments when she felt invisible at home, she finally gave in. The conversations grew, became more intimate. The compliments, which she hadn't heard in a long time, rekindled something in her that, until then, she thought was dead. And this, according to her, wasn't an excuse, it was just the context. Daniel listened silently, his eyes fixed on her, his jaw clenched. Inside him, feelings collided forcefully, revulsion, pity, indignation, curiosity. He wanted to understand. He needed to understand. But what came next surpassed all expectations. Helena took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then said, her voice breaking, that the man had broken up with her 2 days after dinner. That he'd made it clear he'd never wanted a serious relationship, that he'd never imagined she'd go this far, and that she was nothing more than a distraction to him. That he'd met someone else, someone freer, more available, and that he didn't intend to continue with something so complex. He said she'd cried, begged, humiliated herself, and that he'd been cold, direct, and relentless. Daniel watched her unblinkingly, his fingers intertwined on the table, his knuckles white with tension. But what truly devastated him was what Helena revealed next. That, in the days following the breakup, amidst despair and trying to understand how she could have ruined everything for so little, she wrote to the man, begging him not to leave her alone. And he, with unbridled cruelty, responded with screenshots of conversations, screenshots of her statements, of her audio recordings begging to see him. He mockingly shared these messages in a group of old friends, where they laughed and joked about her betrayed husband, about the family destroyed by a bored woman. She said the screenshots reached a mutual acquaintance, who confronted her with contempt, and that since then she had lived under the weight of this silent exposure, afraid that her children would find out, that her parents would find out, that Daniel would discover not only the betrayal but the public humiliation that followed. Daniel closed his eyes, brought his hands to his face, and took a deep breath. The world spun slowly in his head. The ground seemed tilted, unstable. There was anger, yes, but it wasn't the blind rage of betrayal. It was the kind of anger born of compassion mixed with indignation, as if he were witnessing the collapse of a person who had once been everything to him, who was still, in a way, the mother of his children, and who now appeared irreversibly shattered. Helena wept openly, her shoulders trembling, the wet napkin in her hands. She said she knew she would never be the same again, that even if she were forgiven, she would never have what they had again. That the children's gaze was different now. That the parents, silent, avoided prolonged contact. That even the dog seemed hesitant when approached. That she no longer recognized herself. That she couldn't sleep, eat, think of anything other than Daniel's face leaving that restaurant with his children in his hands and teary eyes. She said that, in that moment, she knew she had lost everything. Not just her husband, but the invisible foundations that sustained her, her respect, her dignity, her children's love, her parents' admiration. He said she still had them, but in a different form. That now, even as they forgave her, she knew she would never be the same again. That every kind gesture carried a shadow. That every silence was a reminder. He said that forgiveness, when it came, wouldn't be a hug, it would be a scar. And that the most painful part of it all was knowing I deserved it. Daniel listened, motionless. Time seemed suspended. The waiter approached once to ask if they wanted anything, but upon seeing their faces, he walked away silently. Helena tried to compose herself, wiped her face, and asked for another chance to be heard. She said she didn't want to get back together, not right now, that she didn't expect promises, but that she needed to truly apologize. Not forgiveness for having cheated, but forgiveness for having destroyed the man she admired most. She said that when she saw Daniel with his children, she felt envious that she could no longer be a part of it like before. That she saw the photos on his phone, now with different people, different smiles, and felt a pain that wouldn't go away. That she knew he was starting over. And that, deep down, that was good. But that she would never find peace if she didn't tell him everything. Daniel, with a firm but weary voice, said he didn't hate her. That hate was a word that didn't fit what they'd been through. But that he couldn't go back. That trust, once broken, couldn't be restored. That his children looked at him with pride now, for having held his head high. That he had met a new woman, and that it was still early, but he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. That this woman hadn't tried to take anyone's place, she'd simply made herself present. And that perhaps, therefore, he was willing to allow himself something new. Helena lowered her head. She wept silently now. She said she understood. That she already knew, in fact. That she had seen the photos, heard from Clara about her father's new friend. And that, although it hurt, it was also fair. She asked only that he let her be a part of his children's lives. That he not allow their history to become an open wound in their hearts. Daniel nodded. He said he would never do that. That their children were the purest bond they had. And that, for their sake, he would be fair. But the love between them had died. Helena stood slowly, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and before leaving, looked him in the eye one last time. She told him she was grateful for listening to her. That this was the hardest day of her life, but also the most necessary. And that if he were happy with someone else, she would root for it, because he deserved more than she had given. And with light, almost brittle steps, she walked out the door without looking back. Daniel remained there for a few minutes. He finished his cold coffee. He watched the street's reflection in the window. And as he left, he felt the weight of something that, though devastating, finally seemed to have reached its conclusion. And what came next, would change not only his life, but the way he viewed loss, and beginning anew. That same night, after the cafe encounter, Daniel drove for hours aimlessly. The city lights passed through the windshield like fragments of memories, all disconnected. The steering wheel felt like an extension of his own body, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Helena no longer occupied the center of his heart, but there was a memory so ingrained within her that it would be impossible to simply erase her. The pain was now cold, conscious, and at the same time, something inside him was beginning to heal. The truth had been told. The secret revealed. And as cruel as it had been, there was something liberating in finally knowing everything. Daniel didn't know exactly how, but a part of him felt clean. As if he had weathered a devastating storm and now, soaked to the bone, was finally seeing the sky open. In the following weeks, the routine at home began to rebalance. The children, though still affected by what they had witnessed and their mother's absence in the early days, gradually returned to their usual behavior. Clara drew more often. Lucas had resumed soccer training. The new woman who had appeared in Daniel's life, Anna, gradually became a calm presence, never forced, always respectful. She knew she was entering a territory of reconstruction, and never tried to replace anyone. Her relationship with the children was built patiently, with small, consistent gestures. Daniel didn't see her as a patch, but as a new opportunity to live with the truth. One night, Anna arrived early and prepared dinner with the children. Laughter filled the room as Clara spread flour on the table, trying to cut cookies with star-shaped molds. Lucas, as always, wanted to taste everything before it was ready. Daniel watched from the doorway, unseen, and felt the kind of peace he thought he'd forgotten. When Anna noticed him, she simply smiled and nodded, as if to say, "We're fine." And he, indeed, believed it. Helena, for her part, had distanced herself. After the coffee meeting, she maintained the minimum contact necessary to talk about her children, but remained silent about herself. There were no more attempts at rapprochement, nor any excuses. It was as if she had finally understood that every action has a price, and that regret, however sincere, does not rebuild the spaces that were once destroyed. However, on a rainy Friday, Daniel received a call from his mother-in-law. Her voice was distressed, her tone hesitant. She said Helena had disappeared for 2 days, and although she had sent a brief message saying she was fine, she didn't say where she was or when she would return. Daniel listened in silence, pondered for a moment, and then said that perhaps she just needed some time. That no one throws themselves away for 2 days unless they are trying, in some way, to find themselves. 2 days later, Helena appeared at her parents' house. Her eyes were sunken, her face was drawn, her hands trembling. She said she had traveled alone to a place where no one knew her, that she had spent her days wandering aimlessly, crying for everything she had lost and trying to understand how she had let her life slip through her fingers. She said she hadn't tried anything against herself, but that she understood she had, indeed, let a part of her die. And that now she needed, more than anything, to rebuild what she still could. She asked her parents for forgiveness. She said she knew she would never be the perfect daughter again, but that she wanted to at least be the present daughter again. Her mother-in-law, with tears in her eyes, hugged her. Her father-in-law hesitated, but then hugged her back. There was still love. But the respect, as she had said before, was different now. The following weekend, Helena called Daniel and asked to see the children. He didn't hesitate. He let her spend Saturday with them, picking them up at home in the morning. Anna wasn't there that day, and when Helena saw Daniel open the door, she simply thanked him with a brief gesture. Lucas ran into her arms. Clara was more cautious, but also hugged her. Throughout the day, she took them to the park, bought ice cream, and tried, with every gesture, to show that she was still a mother. Not a perfect mother, not the same as before, but someone trying to start over. Dropping them off at home late that afternoon, Helena stayed in the car for a few minutes. When Daniel came out to greet the children, she simply said, "They're fine, you're raising 2 incredible human beings." He thanked her with a brief nod, without irony, without hurt, and then went back inside. Time passed. The restaurant scandal was in the past. People stopped talking. The gossip ceased. But what remained was what mattered most, the memory. And no one could erase that. Daniel and Anna continued their relationship, now with more solidity. He no longer felt like he was in transition, but rather under construction. He was with her because he wanted to be. And she, in turn, knew how to respect every moment, every space, every silence. One day, Clara had a high fever, and Helena showed up at the hospital uninvited. Daniel was surprised, but didn't question it. She arrived with her bag in hand and a worried expression. She sat beside her daughter, softly sang the same lullaby she'd used when she was a baby, and stayed there until she fell asleep. Daniel, seeing her there, understood something he hadn't yet admitted, that although she was no longer his wife, she would always be the mother of his children. And that, as difficult as it was, required maturity, forgiveness, and mutual respect. Leaving the hospital, they walked together down the corridor in silence. And it was Helena who broke the tension. She said she didn't want to go back, didn't want to ask for anything more, but that seeing Clara sleeping and remembering what she was like as a baby made her understand that she hadn't just betrayed a man, she had betrayed herself. Daniel looked her in the eyes. He said there was no longer room for them as a couple, but there was room for her as a mother. That he wanted her to be there, even if the scar would never fade. She nodded, and there, in that hallway, the cycle of resentment began to end. Time brought new ways of living together. The children's birthdays were celebrated together, but peacefully. With Anna on one side, Helena on the other, and the two parents sharing their love for their children without war. Clara began to understand better, and so did Lucas. Both knew what happened, but they learned that mistakes don't define a person entirely. That everyone can fail, but how you deal with them defines what comes next. Daniel and Helena began to communicate naturally, always focused on the children. And Anna, with her rare sensitivity, never interfered with this bond. And then, one autumn afternoon, sitting on a park bench while the children played, Daniel and Helena exchanged glances. She said, in a light voice, that she still dreamed of the days when he'd wait for her with tea in the living room and her feet were freezing. He smiled wistfully. He said he remembered too, but that now those days were just that, memories. Helena then said something that would forever remain in his mind, I didn't just lose you. I lost who I was when you loved me. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because they both knew that sentence was the cruelest truth of all. And that day, for the first time, Daniel felt, in his suit, free. Because forgiving isn't forgetting, nor is it taking back what was destroyed. It's simply accepting that there was pain, that there was loss, and that life goes on. And in that square, as the sun set and his children's laughter echoed in the background, he understood that love, sometimes, is moving on. Even if a piece of your heart remains forever trapped in another life. In the days following that conversation in the square, everything seemed quieter, not in the sense of an absence of sound, but in the way feelings settled within each person, slowly reorganizing everything that remained after the hurricane. The air was no longer dense, their coexistence was no longer an internal battlefield, and the looks exchanged between Daniel and Helena no longer carried the anguish of the unsaid, but the serenity of those who understood the impossibility of returning. Life no longer united them as before, and this, although it still brought a trace of pain, was also liberating. It was as if they had finally signed, without papers, the closing of a story that, for many years, had been built on solid pillars, but which collapsed the moment the foundation of truth was compromised. Daniel began to walk with more ease. There was something new in his expression, it wasn't complete happiness, nor a superficial euphoria. It was peace. A discreet peace, built with effort, with nights of reflection, with contained tears, and with the difficult art of relinquishing what can no longer be recovered. He now lived without shocks, without checking his phone for messages that never arrived, without anticipating uncomfortable conversations. Everything was clear, resolved, defined. The emotional freedom to move forward, with Anna by his side, was consolidated day by day. Anna was simple in her actions, delicate in her words, but intense in her care. She never demanded anything from him other than her presence. And perhaps that was why Daniel felt so safe by her side, as if he had finally found someone who saw him as he was, without frames or distortions. Meanwhile, Helena was beginning a new phase of her life, one marked by self-reconstruction. She had distanced herself from social media, avoided the same places as before, and spent most of her days focused on her children and small projects that kept her busy. She started attending a reading group at the neighborhood library, and on Sunday nights, she wrote in a notebook she didn't show to anyone. In it, she didn't apologize. She simply recorded, with brutal honesty, everything she felt, the shame of having let a fleeting passion destroy an entire story, the regret of not having realized it in time, the sadness of no longer being able to share life's small moments with someone who had once loved her so truly. The words she wrote weren't meant to be emotional, they were a confession to herself. In Daniel's absence, she had to learn to live with her own silences. The new dynamic between them, though marked by a difficult past, maintained mutual respect. When they needed to discuss matters concerning their children, they spoke objectively and calmly. There was no longer any tension, no explicit hurt. Only the bitter trace of what was and will no longer be. Clara, more sensitive, took longer to accept this new arrangement. Sometimes, she still asked quietly why her parents weren't getting back together, even after they realized they could talk without fighting. Daniel patiently explained that respect and coexistence didn't equal conjugal love, that some things, no matter how much they work out, never go back to the way they were. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed more practical. He accepted Anna's presence naturally and showed sincere affection for her, without this implying any less love for his mother. The complexity of childhood emotions was revealed in small gestures, the way Clara watched Daniel and Anna laugh together, or how Lucas ran into his mother's lap after a soccer game. And in this delicate dance between the new and the old, the family continued. Helena knew she could never compete with the serenity Anna brought to Daniel's life. Not because she was better, but because she arrived at the right time, when he most needed something simple and true. Helena even wondered, in moments of solitude, if that was truly justice or just consequence. But she learned, the hard way, that not everything needs an explanation. Some pain simply exists and needs to be experienced. She stopped blaming herself excessively, but she also didn't try to shirk responsibility. Her mission now was to remain present as a mother, without invading spaces that were no longer hers, and to remain firm in the silent promise she had made to herself to never again lose someone she loved because she couldn't recognize the value of honest love. One morning, during a school meeting, the three of them, Daniel, Anna, and Helena, were called in for a talk with the principal. It was about Clara, who had been showing some introspection in class, participating less and getting distracted easily. Helena was apprehensive, Daniel immediately wanted to understand how to help, and Anna, even though she was only a stepmother, remained present, listening, and welcoming. At the end of the meeting, Clara was called in. And seeing the three of them there, side by side, she hesitated. Then she sat down, lowered her eyes, and said she felt torn. That she loved both parents, but that now everything was different. She said she knew no one would return, but that sometimes she missed the times when they were all together on the couch, watching movies and eating popcorn. Helena held back tears. Daniel reached out and held her hand tightly. He said he understood, that he missed some things too, but that his love for her hadn't changed or diminished. Anna, in a soft voice, said she wasn't there to replace anything, but to add to it. And for the first time, Clara smiled. A shy, small, but sincere smile. That day was a turning point. Helena understood that, even with all the pain, there was room to rebuild bonds, to maintain what was essential, the love for her children. Daniel realized he could coexist with the past without being consumed by it. And Anna, firm in her serenity, showed that it is possible to love someone even while carrying their entire history, including the painful part. Later that afternoon, Clara asked them all to have dinner together at a pizzeria they used to frequent. They sat at a table in the corner, and although the setting was different, there was a hint of harmony. Not like before, but like it could be now. The months passed, and the routine settled like new sand underfoot. Daniel and Anna traveled with the children for the holidays, Helena began participating more actively in school activities, and little by little, the open wounds became scars that, though visible, no longer hurt. There was acceptance. And, more than that, there was learning. But one rainy afternoon, Helena stopped in front of the house where she lived with Daniel and stared at the facade for long minutes. She had passed by chance, but her body made her slow down, stop, and stare. She remembered nights dozing on the couch with her head on his shoulder, children's birthdays celebrated in the backyard, Sunday mornings making pancakes. She knew the house was no longer hers, but it hurt less than before. He started the car and drove on. And that night, she wrote in her notebook, "Perhaps the greatest punishment is not being punished by those we betray, but realizing, too late, that we will never again be the person we were when we were truly loved." That same night, Daniel was sitting with Anna in the backyard, drinking tea while their children slept. They talked about plans for the end of the year, about the possibility of moving to a new neighborhood, about simple things. And in the middle of the conversation, Anna looked at him and said she knew he still carried ghosts, that she didn't expect him to forget, but that she was there for everything he was, not for what could have been. And he, moved, replied that he no longer looked for old versions of himself, because he was happy with the man he had become. Time, as always, followed its course. And what was once pain was now memory. What was once a storm was now a breeze. And what was once a lost love was now just a closed chapter, painful, yes, but closed. And there was, still to come, the moment that would forever seal the fate of each of them. At that early spring, life seemed to have found its rhythm again. The green leaves returned to the trees, the mornings gained more light, and Daniel's steps were lighter, less defensive. The children woke to the sound of birds instead of heavy silences, and the house had become a home again. Not the same as before, not with the same colors, but with more serene, more mature, less naive tones. Daniel had learned to live with the absence of what had been, without suffocating the present with ghosts of the past. Sundays, which had previously carried an indigestible nostalgia, were now filled with simple lunches, light conversations, and genuine moments. Anna was already part of the routine, but never imposing. She knew when to speak and when to be silent, when to occupy and when to withdraw, and that was why she was so present, because she didn't need to force her presence. Daniel liked the way she treated the children, with sincere affection, but without paternalism. She respected boundaries, but also knew how to welcome them. She wasn't trying to be anyone's replacement, just someone she loved and was available to. That, in the end, was all it was. Helena, on the other hand, was facing a quieter, more introspective transition. After the night she wrote that bitter sentence in her notebook, she began attending therapy sessions. For the first time, she allowed herself to unearth deep layers of herself, relive memories from before she even met Daniel, reflect on patterns, on internal absences she had never faced head-on. The sessions were painful and revealing. She discovered that much of what she did wasn't just the result of fleeting dissatisfaction, but an unconscious attempt to fill old holes with fragile loves. For the first time, she understood that Daniel wasn't neglecting her, he simply wasn't responsible for healing wounds she herself had ignored for years. And this discovery was liberating and cruel at the same time. It was easier to blame the other, to imagine that happiness depended exclusively on what her partner did or didn't do. Facing her own responsibility required courage she thought she lacked, but which, with each week, became more palpable. One autumn afternoon, Helena went to school to pick up Clara. Daniel, due to a meeting, had asked her for this favor, and she readily accepted. Upon arriving, she saw her daughter sitting alone on the playground bench, her gaze lost on the ground. She approached slowly and sat beside her without saying anything. Clara, after a minute of silence, said that a classmate had made a cruel comment, that everyone knew what her mother had done to her father, and that it made her feel ashamed. Helena felt such a sharp pain that she almost couldn't respond. But she took a deep breath, held her daughter's hand, and said she understood. She couldn't change what had happened, but she promised to be a woman Clara would be proud to present in the future. She said that, from then on, what she would do with her life would be for her, and for Lucas. That she would never again make decisions without considering what it would mean for them. Clara hugged her tightly, and Helena wept silently, her head resting on her daughter's shoulder, as if asking for forgiveness not only with words, but with her presence. In the following days, Helena returned to writing. But now her words were no longer laments of what had been lost. They were commitments to what could still be built. He began volunteering on Saturdays, helping vulnerable children. He felt he needed, somehow, to give back to the world the chance he had. He didn't seek applause or redemption, He just wanted to build something real, however small. And it was in this simplicity that he began to rediscover parts of himself he thought were dead. One day, bumping into Daniel at a street market, they were both alone. He was carrying bags of vegetables and fruit, she was buying flowers. They looked at each other for a few seconds and smiled. Helena said everything was fine, he replied yes, and for a moment they walked side by side, talking about the children, schoolwork, life. It was different, but comfortable. When they said goodbye, there were no promises, no longing. Only a respect that had finally found its mature form. Later that day, Daniel was at home with Anna. They were organizing old albums with the children. Old photos, trips, birthdays, moments frozen in time. In one of the images, Clara, still small, smiled in her mother's lap, while Daniel held Lucas in his other arm. Anna watched from afar, not jealously, but with a watchful eye. Daniel, noticing, turned to her and said that those records were part of a story he didn't want to erase. That everything he'd experienced had brought him here, to her. And Anna simply said, I know. And that's why I'm staying. It was at that moment that Daniel understood something essential, that true love doesn't erase the past, but respects it. That building something new doesn't require destroying what once was, but understanding. That scars aren't ugly marks, but reminders of battles won. Another weekend, Clara asked everyone to be present at her school theater performance. She wanted her father, her mother, and Anna. Helena hesitated, but Clara was firm, you're my mother. She's the woman my father loves. I want you both there. And so it was. The three important female figures in her life, sitting in the same row, applauding together. At the end, Clara ran and hugged everyone, her heart light, without divisions. In that embrace, something changed. Helena's eyes met Anna's, and for the first time, there was a genuine smile, devoid of competition. A silent recognition. There was no longer any need to compete for space. Each occupied a distinct but equally valuable place. A few months later, Helena was invited to give a talk to a women's group about mistakes, forgiveness, and starting over. Initially reluctant, she eventually accepted. In her speech, she didn't victimize herself, nor did she try to justify past actions. She clearly stated that betrayal isn't just an act against another, but a rupture with one's very essence. That true repentance isn't found in the tears shed, but in the silent transformation that follows the fall. That no one is obligated to forgive, but that forgiveness, when it happens, frees both the giver and the receiver. At the end, many gave a standing ovation. Not for what she had been, but for what she was trying to become. And in that moment, Helena felt, for the first time, that perhaps she could, indeed, be proud of herself. Daniel, in turn, decided it was time to formalize his relationship with Anna. Not in a rush, not out of obligation, but because he felt the time was right. He gathered his children and spoke calmly. He explained that he wouldn't change anything about their mother, but that he wanted to build something with the person who had been by his side these past years, with respect, affection, and truth. Clara smiled. Lucas joked that he wanted to be the page boy at the wedding. And there, without rushing, without a grand ceremony, a new chapter was born. Helena learned the news from Clara, and although her chest tightened, she didn't cry. She smiled, hugged her daughter, and said she hoped to be invited, even if it was to sit in the back rows. And she was. At the intimate ceremony, held on a golden afternoon, Daniel and Anna exchanged discreet vows, filled with meanings only they understood. Helena was there, in a light blue dress and a simple necklace Clara had given her. At the end of the ceremony, she approached them and handed them an envelope containing a letter that was never mentioned again. And, in a firm voice, she simply said, "Thank you for taking such good care of what I almost destroyed." Anna hugged her, Daniel squeezed her hand. There was no more pain. There was maturity, there was learning, there was forgiveness. Their story didn't end like a fairy tale, but perhaps it ended in the only way possible for those who chose to mature, with dignity. Each followed their own path, marked by loss, but also by rebuilding. And in the end, the greatest moral dilemma that loomed over them all, the question of whether it is possible to love after a fall, to forgive after destruction, to live after disappointment, found its answer in simple gestures, in silent choices, in firm steps. Because sometimes the true happy ending isn't in returning to what was, but in finding peace in what has become. And for Helena, Daniel, Anna, Clara, and Lucas, this peace finally began to make sense. The morning after Daniel and Anna's civil wedding, the silence in the house was broken by muffled laughter coming from the kitchen. Lucas was making pancakes with Clara, and Daniel watched them from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the two small figures who, over time, became the reason for his entire reconstruction. Anna, her hair still loose and her wedding ring freshly placed, came downstairs with a coffee in her hand and a smile that conveyed more than joy, it was stability, confidence, and presence. He welcomed her with a long hug, the kind that requires no words. It wasn't a conventional happy ending. It was the beginning of a new cycle, aware of everything left behind. When they looked at each other, they knew they were ready to move on. Not in a hurry, nor as an escape, but with truth. Helena woke up later that day. She was home, alone, but not sad. She woke unhurriedly, made coffee, watered the plants, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel that tightness in her chest as she looked at the empty side of the bed. She had learned to live with the absence of a love that had once been everything. She learned to be content with her own presence. She opened her old notebook, the one that had once been filled with regrets but now held lessons. She wrote a final page. Not for Daniel, nor for her children. For herself. I was the mistake that destroyed the best part of my story, but I chose not to be the shadow that would erase what remained. Today I walk without illusions, but with lightness. She closed the notebook, put it in the drawer, and opened the windows of the house. Light poured in like never before. It was her way of saying, I am alive, and that is already more than I thought it would be. Clara and Lucas, growing up in a reality that, though fragmented, was rebuilt with affection and dialogue, became conscious teenagers. Clara, especially, transformed her sensitivity into strength. She began writing chronicles, short texts about family, love, loss, and new beginnings. In one of her school essays, she wrote, "True love doesn't end when people separate, it ends when we stop learning from what we've experienced." The teacher, moved, asked to read it aloud in class, and Clara read it without stuttering, with firmness. It was the voice of someone who saw her family crumble and, even so, chose not to carry hatred, but rather lessons. Lucas, on the other hand, found his escape in sports. He remained firm, determined, and although less verbal, he always balanced his sister's raw feelings with the rationality he inherited from his father. They both knew their parents would never be a couple again, but they also knew they were surrounded by love, in different, but real, forms. On Clara's birthday, everyone gathered in the backyard of Daniel and Anna's house. It was the first time the entire family was together for a more intimate event, friends, grandparents, aunts and uncles. Helena arrived with a carefully wrapped gift, and upon seeing Anna setting the table with sweets, she walked over to her. The two greeted each other naturally. They talked about school, vacation plans, and the chronicles Clara was writing. There was no longer any tension. There was only respect. Daniel watched them from afar while talking to his father. His father-in-law, who had so judged Helena in the past, now saw everything from a different perspective. He commented, sincerely, that he never imagined the family would reach this point of equilibrium. Daniel simply said, because we only understand forgiveness when we choose to move on. That evening, after the guests had left, Clara showed everyone a video she had prepared. It featured images of memorable moments, from childhood to the present day, interspersed with quotes she had written herself. One of them read, "Not all betrayal ends in destruction. Sometimes, it paves the way for each person to discover who they truly are." Helena wept silently. Anna held Daniel's hand. Their eyes met, not with nostalgia, but with the certainty that the journey had been worth it. Every tear, every silence, every reconciliation. Weeks later, Helena decided to move to another city. Not to escape, but by choice. She wanted to start over in a place where her story wouldn't be a recurring whisper on every street corner. She wanted to work with at-risk children and found a position at a social project in another region. Before leaving, she gathered her children, Daniel and Anna, and told them that this decision wasn't a departure, but a continuation of what she had been building, a life worthy of the forgiveness she had received. Daniel respected her feelings. Anna offered help. Clara cried, Lucas hid it. But they both knew that their mother was finally whole again, even though she was leaving. The departure was peaceful. Helena took with her a box of letters from her children, a photo of the four of them at a past Christmas, and the blue-covered notebook. At the station, before boarding, Daniel hugged her. He said he hoped she would be happy, that she would find what she had spent so long searching for outside her home. And she replied that she was no longer searching. That now, she was just walking. Daniel and Anna remained steadfast. Their relationship solidified without needing to prove anything to anyone. It was a story built from the rubble, but with noble materials, patience, empathy, truth. Their children grew up under the example of a father who forgave, a woman who rebuilt, and another who loved without invading. An unconventional but powerful combination. Time passed. Clara was accepted into literature. Lucas excelled in sports and went to university on a scholarship. Helena visited on holidays. Daniel and Anna traveled together, laughing more easily. There were no more traces of pain, only memories that taught them. And that Christmas, sitting around the table, everyone was there, Helena, Daniel, Anna, the children, the grandparents. The tree twinkled with discreet lights, and the scent of cinnamon wafted from the kitchen. Soft music could be heard in the background, and laughter mingled. A family that wasn't perfect, but that survived. And more than that, they learned to love each other, even in new ways. Now that you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Do you believe it's possible to forgive someone who destroyed everything? Share your opinion, we want to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Every week we have real, shocking, and moving stories like this one. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It breaks homes, erodes bonds, extinguishes dreams, and changes lives. No fleeting passion is worth the pain of losing someone who truly loves you. This channel will never support any kind of betrayal. Here, what we defend is the love that builds, the truth that liberates, and the maturity that rebuilds. Until the next story.